10 minutes, Melanchthon. That's all it took to break them. The king's finest surrendered in a ditch.
10 minutes to win the fight, Daniel. But we just lost the lake. And as long as this cable sits in the mud, the USS Superior is nothing but a hollow shell in Sackets Harbor. That cable is 600 feet long and weighs 5 tons. The roads are a muddy bog. So tell me, Major, how in the devil am I supposed to get that rope to the shipyard?
To understand how these men found themselves facing this impossible task, we have to go back to the beginning of the War of 1812. In 1812, the young United States declared war on Great Britain. Britain had been stopping American ships and forcing American sailors to serve in their navy. They were also blocking American trade while fighting Napoleon in Europe. Most people remember the War of 1812 as a series of iconic, scattered snapshots. We remember the burning of Washington, D.C., the sky glowing orange as the White House was gutted by fire. We remember the bombs bursting in air over Fort McHenry and the massive star-spangled banner that inspired our national anthem. We even remember the Battle of New Orleans, where Andrew Jackson stood his ground after the war was technically over. But while the world watched the smoke rise from the coast, the fate of the American experiment was actually being decided in the North. To understand the impossible task these men eventually faced, we have to look at the strategic jugular of the continent. In 1812, the northern frontier was a wilderness of impenetrable forests and bottomless bogs. There were no interstates, no railroads, and the few roads that existed were often just widened Indian trails that turned into deep, muddy ruts during the spring thaw. In this landscape, the Great Lakes weren't just water, they were the only true highways. This created a massive problem for the British. Every musket ball, every barrel of salted pork, and every ounce of gunpowder for the British Army in the West had to travel 3,000 miles across the Atlantic, then up the St. Lawrence River to their naval base in Upper Canada, Kingston. This was the American opportunity. If the U.S. could seize control of Lake Ontario, they could cut that St. Lawrence lifeline. The British forts in Detroit, Mackinac, and the entire Ohio Valley would have starved into surrender without a single shot being fired. But there was a terrifying countermove, the backdoor invasion threat. If the British gained naval superiority, they could launch an amphibious invasion force at any point along New York's Lake Ontario shoreline. A successful British push from the north could have linked up with their naval forces on the Atlantic coast, effectively cutting the New England states off from the rest of the Union and ending the United States as we know it. The only thing standing in their way was the shipyard of the tiny village of Sackets Harbor. As long as the American fleet was strong enough to challenge the British at Kingston, that back door to the American heartland remained locked. But keeping that door locked required an industrial miracle. Sackets Harbor, once a quiet frontier outpost, transformed into a sprawling, frantic shipyard. Thousands of shipwrights, carpenters, and sailors descended on the village, turning local timber into the heavy ribs of warships at a feverish pace. It was a cold-blooded race of naval architecture. In Kingston, the British were building the HMS St. Lawrence, a massive first-rate ship of the line. To counter it, the Americans laid the keel for their own giant, the USS Superior. Designed to carry up to 66 guns, the Superior was intended to be the most powerful vessel ever to sail the Great Lakes. But by May of 1814, as the ship sat in the harbor ready for launch, the Americans faced a devastating problem. A warship is a hollow shell without its teeth and its tether. The Superior's heavy 32-pounder guns and her massive 5-ton anchor cable were still miles from the shipyard. Having been shipped from the Brooklyn Navy Yard up the Hudson, then westward through the Mohawk River, Oneida Lake, and Wood Creek, the vital stores sat stalled at Oswego Falls, modern-day Fulton. Commodore Isaac Chauncey had dispatched Master Commandant Melanchthon Woolsey to oversee the cargo, where he waited for a gap in the British naval blockade to attempt the final 50-mile run up the coast to Sackets Harbor. The British knew the Americans were one ship away from seizing the lake. They knew the guns were vulnerable, and they were already moving their fleet to ensure the Superior never left the harbor. The British move was swift and overwhelming. On the morning of May 5, 1814, a massive squadron of 8 warships under Commodore Sir James Lucas Yeo appeared off the coast of Oswego. On board were over 1,000 elite troops, including Royal Marines and the Glengarry Light Infantry. Their objective was simple: find the teeth of the American fleet. Standing in their way was Fort Ontario, a star-shaped fortification perched on a bluff overlooking the lake. It was a crumbling relic from the Revolutionary War, defended by fewer than 300 men under Lieutenant Colonel George Mitchell. At 1 o'clock, 15 British gunboats charged the shore. They expect fire from the heights, but Mitchell had sent Lieutenant Daniel Blaney a lone 12-pounder, and its crew down to the water's edge. 1 gun, 1 crew, pinpoint accuracy. Blaney's fire ripped into the flotilla, forcing the British into a full retreat. But on May 6th, the wind died down, and the heavy frigates Prince Regent and Princess Charlotte moved in. They unleashed a thunderous bombardment, their heavy guns trading fire with the fort's handful of 12-pounders. Under the cover of this smoke and iron, the British launched an amphibious assault. Hundreds of redcoats hit the beach and charged up the steep, muddy slopes toward the fort. The Americans fought a desperate tactical retreat. Mitchell knew he couldn't hold the fort, but his mission wasn't to win the battle. It was to buy time. When the British finally took the fort and raised the Union Jack, they found the fort abandoned and the barracks in flames. They seized some food, flour, and a few smaller guns, but the big prize, the heavy 32-pounders for the Superior, was nowhere to be found. The guns were already 12 miles upriver, safely tucked away at Oswego Falls. The British had taken the ground, but they had missed the kill. Failing to capture the cannon and supplies, the British left the fort and retreated to the Galoo Islands to lie in wait, hoping to capture them on their way to Sackets Harbor. For 3 weeks, the fate of the American Navy sat in the mud at Oswego Falls. But as long as these supplies sat in the woods, the fleet at Sackets Harbor remained paralyzed. Time was the one resource Woolsey didn't have. With the British fleet patrolling the coast, a daylight run was suicide. He needed a miracle, and on May 28th, he got one. After moving the stores from the safety of the falls down to the lakefront, the skies broke open. A driving rain and a pitch-black night provided the only cover the Americans would get. At 9 p.m., 19 bateaux, loaded with the precious supplies, pushed off into the blackness of Lake Ontario. To avoid detection, the men rowed with muffled oars for 9 long hours. They hugged the shoreline so closely They could hear the waves breaking on the rocks just feet away. By the time the sky turned gray on the morning of May 29th, they had covered 20 miles, reaching the mouth of the Salmon River. In the darkness and the fog, the British had captured the trailing boat at dawn. They knew what was being moved, where it was going, and they were coming for the rest. At the Salmon River, the mission changed from a naval escape to a coordinated land and water operation. Here, they were met by 130 Oneida Nation warriors and Major Daniel Appling's 1st U.S. Riflemen. While the sailors rowed, the Oneida and riflemen followed along the shore. For the next 15 miles, they moved as a shadow force through the swamps and brush of the lake road, little more than an Indian trail, shielding the slow-moving bateau from any British landing parties. By mid-afternoon, the men had been on the oars for over 15 hours. They were at the breaking point. The British knew exactly what was in the water, and their fast-moving gunboats were already closing the gap. Woolsey knew he couldn't win a race in the open lake. He made a tactical pivot, ordering the heavy bateau off the water and into the narrow, winding mouth of South Sandy Creek. He wasn't just looking for a place to hide. He was choosing the ground where he would fight. Deep in the marsh, about 1.5 miles inland from the open lake, the creek made a sharp, near 90-degree oxbow bend. Any vessel navigating that turn would be forced to slow almost to a dead stop to avoid the mud banks. This was now Major Daniel Appling's battle. Appling, a veteran of the U.S. 1st Rifle Regiment, recognized this oxbow as a perfect natural funnel. He positioned his elite riflemen in the dense underbrush and high grass lining the high bank just above the bend. Across the narrow water, deep in the thicket of the eastern swamp, over 100 Oneida warriors slipped silently into cover. They formed a second layer of the ambush, invisible from the creek below. Appling was not creating a defensive line. He was creating a classic L-shaped killing zone. The British would be caught from the front, from the flank, and from behind, with no room to deploy and nowhere to hide. By 9 a.m. on May 30th, the trap was set. Captain Stephen Popham and James Spilsbury led a British gunship flotilla up the creek toward the final bend. They saw exactly what they expected, the masts of Woolsey's bateau, visible through the tree lines, further upstream. To the British, it looked like a panicked retreat that had simply run out of water. Popham was cautious but overconfident. He landed a party of 200 sailors and Royal Marines to clear the banks. As they marched forward, they passed the very thickets where Major Appling's riflemen waited silently, fingers hovering over triggers. The British gunboats moved to the narrowest part of the oxbow. They were now in the V of the ambush. The sailors began to believe the big prize, the cannons for the Superior, were finally within their grasp.
Fire! Yeah!
Out of the sulphurous fog of the American volley, the signal of defeat emerged.
We surrender!
It was a sight the Royal Navy rarely afforded its enemies. In less than 10 minutes, the British force had been shattered. The battle was over. The British had lost nearly their entire force, killed, wounded, or captured. The Americans had lost almost nothing. But as the adrenaline faded, the sheer weight of the mission returned.
10 minutes, Melanchthon. That's all it took to break them. The King's finest surrendered in a ditch.
10 minutes to win the fight, Daniel. But we just lost the lake. And as long as this cable sits in the mud, the USS Superior is nothing but a hollow shell in Sackets Harbor. That cable is 600 feet long and weighs 5 tons. The roads are a muddy bog. So tell me, Major, how in the devil am I supposed to get that rope to the shipyard?
The clock was ticking, and the British blockade remained a looming shadow on the horizon. For the next few days, the banks of South Sandy Creek became a logistical hub. Every ox, wagon, and cart within 10 miles was impressed into service. One by one, the 21 massive cannons and the supplies were hauled up the muddy banks and into the carts, then sent on their way up to Sackets Harbor. The dead were buried, the wounded were treated at the nearby Otis house, and the remaining British prisoners were marched to Sackets Harbor, guarded by Major Appling's riflemen. After a few days, the only thing that remained was the 5-ton, 600-foot-long great cable for the Superior. Being too big to fit into an ox cart, the problem remained until a young local militiaman named Silas Lyman made a crazy suggestion.
We can carry it!
Carry it? All of that?
Yes, we can.
Nearly 200 men stepped into the line and lifted the fate of the American fleet onto their shoulders. The hemp, rough, wet, and abrasive, bit into their shoulders instantly. They used grass mats and scraps of fabric to pad the friction, but their shoulders were still left bloody and bruised. The pace was slow, less than a mile an hour. Every step was a battle against the mud and the weight of the cable. The trek lasted nearly 3 grueling days. They made their first major stop in Ellisburg, and by the second night, they collapsed in the village of Belleville. In every town, the column grew as local farmers stepped in to relieve the bloodied shoulders of the men before them. On the third day, they finally marched into Sackets Harbor. They were met by a deafening roar from the townspeople and the shipyard workers. The mission was a triumph of logistics over luck. With her anchor cables secured and her heavy guns mounted, the USS Superior took to the lake as the most powerful warship in the American fleet. The British, seeing the naval balance shift, abandoned their blockade and retreated to Kingston. The logistics race was over, and the American supply lines were safe. The War of 1812 would end in a stalemate months later, and the United States would go on to become a world power. Today, 3 monuments along County Route 75 mark the path of that 5-ton cable. They stand as a permanent reminder of a time when a community's grit and a single heavy rope helped hold a nation together.